Hi, everybody. Well, it's episode, what is it, Gary? It's season 2, Guest Safety Officer Lobby Group, and it's episode 21. Yes, I got it wrong last time. We're here today to discuss the HMRC meeting that took place last Thursday. And we're very fortunate to have with us Michael Kill, Chairman of the NTIA, and the marvelous, dynamic Annie-Marie Chebib, who is going to, those two are going to help us weave our way through some of the issues that were raised. Now, just to set the scene, it was an interesting meeting. Within the context is that for an hour, we were basically told that everyone will be tax compliant as an individual and as a company. You cannot hide. There is no hiding place. They will hunt you down. They've talked about data scrapes for DWP, various other things. They are all coming for you. Do not think that you can escape. And this is what we're here to decide and discuss today, is what does that look like and what will it look like for the future of security within the social economy. And by that, I mean those working as guest safety officers and working in the events field. So let's see. Mike, you organised this. It's your fault. Please set the scene.
So no scaremongering then.
No.
just a point that you can't hide anywhere. Look, the reality is we were approached probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, had a meeting with HMRC. HMRC wanted to do a little bit of soul searching. They had a preconceived opinion that there was a huge amount of tax fraud, tax loss. We were also going through a period where there were a lot of cash payments happening on doors, door security being tempted off for cash payments. And we were aware of ad hoc companies, not all, that were working outside of the guidelines in terms of, their way of working. So this was brought up. We were asked to do some work in terms of where we saw the tax loss. We had some open discussions. We sat with a group of UK DSA operators, had some bigger conversations around things like the Agencies Act and the expectation. And the clear message was, look, you can either come inside the tent and help us manage this through, or you can stand outside the tent and we will drive this forward, because at the moment there is a considerable amount of people that are non-tax compliant. Not all, but there are a considerable amount out there that are non-tax compliant. And what they were very clear on was the culpability range from the individual to the resource supply to the end user in terms of tax fraud and how they sat within that chain in terms of due diligence. So our work was really brought around by saying we need almost an amnesty period, although they didn't like the word amnesty, which I was absolutely battered for when I sat down with anyone senior, particularly with some of the senior directors in HMRC. What they were looking for is almost a hiatus, a period. I was looking for a period where we had an opportunity to get our house in order, where HMRC would not go after people, but we'd be able to communicate through an overarching tax compliance notice. Now, that tax compliance notice is something that they were going to put out. They applied for the tax compliance notice through the different committees, and they were waiting for sign-off. And we're still within that sort of process, because there's a lot of technicalities around how it's lawful terminology, et cetera, et cetera. But in the meantime, there's been a huge amount of work that's gone on between SIA, DWP, HMRC, and the NPCC. So bear this in mind. You've got the individuals which are covered by DWP and the SIA and HMRC to a point, but what they're very clear of is through the investigations that they have done through Australia and Southern Ireland, is there were processes that went through to clean up the industry in terms of ensuring that there wasn't that fraudulent sort of process. And what they found, I think they gained about £10 million back in or €10 million back in Southern Ireland just by doing the scrape between DWP and the SIA. HMRC worked with us to see how many companies were out there outside of ACS. I think there's something like about 11,000, which they've now got access to that data, and they've gone through to get through all of those contact details for people, and they understand where they are. And then the last bit was the NPCC, which is the National Police Commissioners Council through Scott Green, who through meetings we had endorsed the fact that he wanted a compliant security sector, and he would endorse the SIA, DWP and HMRC position by squeezing the end. So the key thing here is individual communication from DWP, SIA and HMRC to company or resource company, which would be squeezed by HMRC, SIA, not so much DWP, but from a compliance perspective would be. And then the last bit is the end user, which would be the NPCC. From a licensing perspective, would squeeze all the different pieces of the puzzle. So that's the way it was set up. The compliance notice is still in the air. They are hoping one way or another to get an answer, I would say probably in the next 3 to 6 months. From that perspective, we pushed for us to get something out so people were aware, hence the reason for the webinar, because what we didn't want to do is wait for a compliance notice to be in and we're all sort of scrambling away trying to do it. Because the reality is, as someone said to me, is when does this come into effect? The reality is most people are non-compliant at the moment, one way or another. So it's in effect now. That's the bit that people don't get, is it's that non-compliance already exists. So the idea from our perspective is let's engage, let's manage the process, let's manage the timeline, let's make sure that people are aware. The webinar last week was an education process over the course of several tranches of these. We're hoping to make sure that we sort of ramify the industry so that the operator, the individual and the resource are aware. There are several things that are also being discussed in the background, so things like minimum wage and some of the other challenges around resource fallout, which we're talking to DWP and the Department of Trade and Industry as well, where we're looking at different initiatives so that we can see if we can make up that shortcoming. So without going into the laborious detail, you can kind of see our position on this, and it was better to be on the front foot than the back foot. Does that set the scene for you?
Yeah, I think you've not done bad there, actually. But I think probably Annie, you know, your good self, as chair, you know, what a great place to come in. That this is probably going to be one of the biggest decisions and topics to be discussed for some time. So, you know, have you got a view from your perspective in the organisation of the UKCMA?
I mean, yes, I have a view, and I think my personal view and my view as chair at the UKCMA are exactly the same view on this occasion. So, firstly, I don't think they're telling us anything we shouldn't be doing anyway. So, you know, at the end of the day, we at the UKCMA about 2 years ago we put together a charter for change, and one of those pieces was making sure everybody was paying their tax and that, you know, everybody was doing what they were supposed to be doing legitimately, because to legitimize this industry is one of the biggest things that we have to do, and this is one of the biggest pieces around that. So actually I welcome the fact that they're involving us in this process at this stage, and through Michael that we've managed to get a forum with them already before we get the compliance notice. And I think the compliance notice is obviously good news for people to have a bit of time to get their house in order, but at the same time, this is what people should have been doing for a very long time. I think the one that caught me by surprise in the whole piece was that we were going to be responsible for the tax across subcontractors and their and tertiary subcontraction, which I think is a much bigger deal for the events industry than any other part of the industry potentially, although there is quite a lot of subcontraction goes on with national companies on pubs and clubs. So I think there's also a piece there. I think one that surprised a lot of people that didn't surprise me was the links to organised crime and quite how much relevance that has to what we do, that actually the chance of weakness in security as a professional industry and the risk that we put our public at for organized crime, it links very directly to tax. And so actually what this can do is quantify a lot of the problems that we can't quantify, because as the industry, we're not in a position to be able to frame this piece in the same way that DWP, HMRC and SIA are. So I actually totally applaud the fact that we've been given a chance to do it and been given some time and a respite. We saw this with the building industry about 10 years ago. So this is something where they will pick an industry that they think is the most at risk and go after it. And I think that actually they're saying, we're coming for you now. You've got a bit of notice, get your house in order. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that, because actually those of us that have been paying all those millions of pounds of tax over the years, you know, why have we been paying if it isn't for us to be supported? I mean, I have a lot of questions, but those questions about what budget is there for enforcement, you know, like the ins and outs of this piece, like how are they going to enforce this? You know, is this a paperwork exercise where they enforce and just give notices out, which would be a lot easier than them checking on sites for things? So there are, you know, Michael, you may be able to answer some of the questions, I think, but all in good time. These are questions about the devil being in the detail a little bit for me.
I think what I just, sorry, because I do want, we've got Gary, and as we're going to talk about organised crime, I can't think of a better time to bring anyone in than Gary about, in terms of, we were talking, weren't we, about a potential black market for.
We were in, yeah, because what we were speaking about is how they are going to police this. What Annie just said, how they're going to enforce it, how they're going to police it, and is it going to cause a black market? Is it going to cause us a worse situation where, we will have people with licenses still under the table being paid cash on small business? How is it going to affect them? And would it be easy for them to pay these guys and girls cash and creating this black market, going back to where we stood back in the late 90s?
I think the challenge that you've got is really sort of it's three or fourfold. So the way that they're going to approach this initially is they're going to write to every security company out there in terms of their tax compliance to give them a very clear notice, right? That's the first stage. The second stage they're looking at is doing the overlay of DWP's database against the SIA database, so that they're going to, what I call a scrape, well, they don't like the word of it, but a scrape to see where there are contingents between the two in terms of sick pay and disability and all the other bits that go along with it. What you have to remember with all of this is, while we talk about DWP and the paperwork exercise and the SIA and the work that they're doing, the NPCC hold the keys to every single venue out there. So when you talk about licensing officer visits and police visits, we're talking about the NPCC having a tie-in on a nightly basis going out, and there will be enforcement movement and reporting of people who are not compliant. And this is where, while we talk about the SIA, DWP and HMRC, we're not taking into account the operational infrastructure of licensing officers on a local authority base, which we're engaging with, and police licensing officers. Bearing in mind that we did our first training course 2 weeks ago to PALO, which are the police licensing officers trainees. We had nearly 100 of them on there. So what we are now doing is seeing a way that we're capturing all of the components to this cycle, from the individual operators or individual operatives to the resource supply to the end user. And if the end user is being squeezed and license is license critical, there is no way in a month of Sundays they're going to compromise for someone else. Now, yes, I agree completely that there are some challenges with some of the smaller companies, and that's something that's been brought up and being considered, the same way that resource is another one that's being considered, and it's something we're working through. Hence the reason why we know that no one's going after it with a big, we're not beating the bushes to get the pheasants out. What we're doing is going, listen, this is an education. This is your opportunity to understand. Please understand, start moving forward. And it's almost like let's start moving forward and getting as many people on board as possible. And what we've started is a motion of people whispering amongst each other, going, listen, this is coming, this is happening. NPCC and policing are involved, and people are going to tie up this process, whether they like it or not. So I think what we've done is we've started the ball rolling. By no means is this the start and end to a process. And without a doubt, I think this is going to take a good few years to get everyone under control. Without a doubt, there will be those people. If you turn around and say July 1st next year, they'll run their companies till July, like June 29th, and then they'll fold the company. You know that, I know that. But the reality is what we're trying to do is create a level of professionalism across the estate. And, you know, I would rather take a handle on it and drive it and have some control over our destination than sit on our hands and watch things collapse. And that was the issue that I had 2 years ago, where I recognized that this was going to be an issue and really started to bring all of the components together, because we worked quite hard to bring HMRC, SIA, DWP and the NPCC all in one room. That's never happened, even with the HMRC leading it. Speaking to Mark Burtonwood, I mean, the first thing he said to me, he said, it's the first time I've ever seen them doing things joined up. He said, and I've been trying to get at this since I was at the SIA. So I think we've taken some positive steps forward, but by no means are we at the end of a journey. And I think it's going to be a challenging one. But in answer to your question with regard to resource, the one thing I would say to you is we've done some work about the amount of money that's going to be lost. And we also did some work around the proportion of people that we think would be compliant or non-compliant. And what they've done is built the resource model in terms of investment on enforcement around our prediction of non-compliance.
Okay, but Annie, can you? I don't know if you noticed, but Annie, you want to speak on that point, don't you?
Well, I could. I just think to the point of that, I think, you know, this is going to go one of two ways. I think there's going to be a number of people who join direct with the bigger companies rather than working for smaller outfits. So one way this will professionalize itself is by the fact that people will join the larger companies instead of working for outfits where they've gone, you know, they've dissolved their company on the 29th of June, as you know, Mike's put it. And I think it has a propensity to do, as Gary said, the opposite of that and drive some of this underground. But I think NPCC and the work that can be done there, from listening to Michael, what Michael said, and talking to Michael about this, I think, you know, NPCC will be the first to be, if they're the first in front of the, you know, in the enforcement line, if you like, there's not really going to be anywhere to hide, because licensing checks, et cetera, happen on a daily, regular, weekly basis. Events do give that capability. And I suppose one of my questions is how many people, if it's just SIA licensed staff and it's not stewards, we've got another big gap and another big place that people can go. So I think one of my big questions for HMRC is, can we please talk about stewarding as well as security? Because what we can't have is us companies writing plans which reflect the desire and position to be in an area where they're not being watched rather than an area where they are. That's the risk. It is one of the risks if we're not careful.
Just to give you some confidence, the stewarding conversation happened very early on.
Good. That's great to hear.
So it
needs to.
Yeah. So what we did really is we've had probably about 7 or 8 meetings leading up to this. And I've sort of spoke to different quarters of the industry to get perspectives on how this would impact.
Yeah.
And off the back of the conversation we had, Annie, we had long conversations about stewarding, yes. So that was brought up.
Thank you.
There's lots of things that are considered, but they are looking at treating them the same way. So
I think that's super important, isn't it? You know, it's harder because the SIA, they don't have the license database for the SIA. It is harder, but also I think that's where a lot of it hides at the moment.
But I think the thing about it is tax compliance goes all the way through, whether you're a steward or a SOTA. I think that's the thing that's got to be considered. So I think that, like you say, I mean, there's going to take some refinements for this. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but you know, we're moving in a direction which could really alter the course of the industry. Now, I mean, just to give you a perspective, I've been having conversations over the last 2 years, and I've had the same, oh, it's never going to happen, it's this and that. And that meeting, realistically, everyone that I spoke to prior to that, all the operators phoned me up and they went, right, I've got it. I understand. I get exactly what you're saying. Shit. And that's exactly the, you know, but the fact of the matter is, I mean, I had a large casino chain that phoned me and they went, never going to happen, it's not going to happen, to their security supplier. And he phoned me and he said, look, I've got this problem. They're not listening to me. They're just doing what they think is right. And da da da. So they picked up the phone to me. I talked it through with them. They went to their accountant, worked it out, completely changed their model, completely changed it. So it's things like that that I've been involved in over the last 2 years. I've had security companies who've bit the bullet and gone PAYE completely, even to the point that it's been marginalized. But what they've had to utilize is that volume to actually get them through. So there's lots of people who are already biting the bullet and having to move forward. There's lots of corporates that have already transitioned across. And I mean, I had one the other day is you know, said to me, well, what's what level of due diligence? And the problem is you've got that reasonably practicable question every time. What is enough to safeguard you moving forward? And a lot of the questions are if I only ask for ACS, am I covered? And I'm like, it's not about ACS. It's about you being tax compliant and making sure that you're doing the checks. I don't care whether you're ACS or you're not. Their issue is, are you tax compliant? Right? The SIA would like ACS to move forward, but you know, as we all know, there are challenges around that situation as well. And what I didn't want this to be was a promotion of ACS. What I wanted it to be is for the tax disparity that we face within our industry to be eradicated, so that we're all on a platform and we're all working towards a stronger sector as a whole. That's the way that I saw the value in this. Nothing more, nothing less. And the SIA have got to deal with the market as it sits until they can really grasp something that's either mandatory or is business licensing, which I think the conversations we're having in different circles is looking more probable, but not under the current government.
But can I there's two things I want to raise. I mean, listen, and there's firstly, I get the organizer and the NPCC. Yeah, the problem I have with that is I have known stories, and I'm sure you will have done across the years. Frank Partridge being the most public one, where the licensing officer, you know, was running a criminal enterprise for his own benefit. I don't blame the security companies for taking advantage of that. You know, it's business, and they be out of business. And I know it's happening in other places, both in London, outside of London. It's unfortunate, but it's true. The other side that goes through, Gary, the other thing we mentioned is about small companies like yours, yeah, being driven, as Annie suggested, that they're being forced to go into work or into business or be swallowed up by large companies. Gary.
Yeah, I mean, the point of that thing is you know, is it going to be the big boys game? Is that the whole idea? You know, we're going to fade out all the smaller companies. As Andy says, people will start going to work for the bigger companies rather than the smaller companies. We've got all the small independent security companies who do work very hard, who are tax compliant, are going to be pushed to the wayside. And again, using the Frank Partridge situation, is it going to be one of those things where you can only use a big company now? They've got to be ACS registered. They've got to be tax compliant. Hang on, we are tax compliant, you know, but we're not ACS. Well, you've got to be both. Is that going to happen, Mike?
So, in answer to your questions, there are plenty of small businesses that I know that are working within this regime at the moment, for one. So I don't think that that's the case. I just think it's a matter of getting on board with it as early as possible and communicating and working with the suppliers. One of the suppliers I've worked with recently, I went through the process of explaining. They used me to explain it to people so that they could share the burden of the rate increase and things like that. So we worked quite closely with them, and I've done that on many accounts with some of the smaller businesses and their contracts and explained to them exactly what's coming. So there is a process and a support mechanism which we're trying to get some communication out to, because what we don't want this is to be at the behest of the bigger companies in any way, shape or form. I think it's really important the ones that are doing it the right way get as much support as possible, and that's also been communicated to the SIA, HMRC, NPCC and everybody else. So I think that's one part of it. In terms of the Partridge situation, listen, there are shock indoor staff the same way that there are organized crime gangs, right?
Yeah.
Got to work on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
And, you know, they accept that has muddied the water and created some issues. Yeah. Proportionately, I'd like to think it's a small proportion, the same way that I'd like to think the security side is a small proportion. But when you see the diagrams of 154 businesses that are intricately sort of woven in and part of a organized crime gang sort of mechanism for fraudulently avoiding tax, you've got to admit that I think that there's a little bit of work on both sides that we've got to consider. And that's something we're going to have to work through. It's not going to be an overnight process, but I'm not sat here going, wow, that's going to be a massive void. We're not talking 50% of the industry facing that situation. I would hope not anyway. But, you know, like everything, policing on both sides of the fence, you know, it's about personalities on the ground, you know, good people one side, bad people other, you know, there's lots to work through, but I don't think proportionately we are sat here with a huge issue in terms of licensing officers, because I think since the Partridge thing, there is a lot more work to vet some of the working spot checks, et cetera, that are going on out there. And similarly, I think, you know, from a security perspective, you know, there are now some scrutiny in terms of HMRC and the different sort of things. So I think we're working towards a better place. It's not an overnight process, as you can understand, but we also have to understand.
Let's come back on that, Michael, because I think it'd be really interesting to know what proportion of companies this relates to, which is a bit we don't know at the moment, and we probably will never find out. But it would be very interesting to know
in terms of self-employed.
Of people who are actively tax avoiding. I'd love to know how many people that is in the industry.
They estimate between 150 and 200 million pounds worth of lost.
Out of how much though?
Well, they're talking about the industry as a whole.
Yes, exactly. So I'd like to, you know, for us, it would be really useful to know what percentage that looks
what
like.
They're saying is about 70% of the industry is self-employed at the moment.
Okay, well, I think to come back on Gary's point as well, because it's an interesting one. Like, Gary, if you are tax compliant as a smaller business, and we are and you are, if you really are running like that, actually, you'll find that this is a lot easier to manage than the bigger companies, because the bigger companies have a lot more subcontraction, a lot more, you know, some companies employ, you know, 4 levels of subcontraction they're now going to be responsible for. Whereas if you're running a smaller, straightforward company, I was talking to 2 of the very big companies this week based on the information we got from HMRC and some of the questions that they've been asked to be answered today. But actually, I thought I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I would much rather be in my shoes where my company is manageable and I'm tax compliant than I would try to be responsible for hundreds of thousands of staff or thousands of staff, which is where we used to be 10 years ago. So for me, there's a real feel of like, actually, probably a company our size or your size is in a much better position to be able to manage this if you're currently tax compliant.
Definitely. I agree with that.
What I would say to you, and I agree with you, Annie, a lot of people are saying, oh, it's the small businesses that are under pressure. It's not. The big businesses are as much pressure, if not more pressure, because of the due diligence process. And what they are is they are super non-compliant in terms of due diligence. And the further down the chain they have, the less control they have, and the more self-employed proposition is available. So what I would say to you, and as you quite rightly sort of has highlighted, is, I mean, we, through different sort of proposition, we estimated about 70% at least of the door security industry or security industry working within the front line was self-employed. So, and they estimated, we said about 120 to 150 million pounds worth of fraudulent or lost revenue. So that then proportionately, we had to work back, if we went out with a tax compliance notice and we were able to access everybody, what proportion of people would not comply, and then what resource level would be required to drive them through to compliance. So that's the work that's been done in the background. So this has not been done on a, you know, we've thrown it out there. We've kind of worked that process, and you know, it's not easy, and I don't think it's, you know, there's no 100% accurate. But what we've done is proportionately had a look at what's out there and exactly, you know, and got some feedback from different portions of the sector. But
I think, sorry, Mike. Sorry, Mike. The thing that I do want to say, because it goes back to the tax compliance, etc. Conversations that I've had over the years with big companies, and it's quite entertaining. There is a disconnect at C-suite in these big companies. It's their baby. They're talking about something that their policies, their HR, it's all there. Everybody's worked so hard to make it so. And they absolutely believe that it doesn't happen. What they don't realize is that further down the chain, Ian, whose job depends on getting X number of people on that day, will have a mobile, a burner, and say, get me 3 people, because I'm not going to make this contract. Because if I fail, the company fails, I'm out of a job. And unfortunately, that happens. The further you go with your layers of management, the more pressure it is on them to comply, to succeed, to build their own personal standing within the company, that unfortunately, they don't tell the top C-suite what's happening.
Bear in mind that, I mean, I probably had about 30 or 40 conversations about procurement managers changing their contractual agreements with security procurement based on a supply that is, literally rife with due diligence. And also some of them, I think one of them actually put in terms of not having only either direct supply or not having 2 or 3 sort of tranches of resource. So there's a lot of them that are waking up to it very quickly. So what you've got to remember is the squeeze is coming from end user as it is being pushed up, and resource and responsibility. So it's, I think we've captured everything in the chain, which is the key thing. But that's not going to, it's not going to be at the pest of some level of fallout, which is something we've got to consider.
Sorry, Annie. One thing we talked about Southern Ireland, and at the moment we looked at bits and pieces there. They've got a big shortfall in security operatives out there, and they're advertising over here. They're advertising great money to go to Ireland and fill those spots. So looking at what happened there, is it going to be the same thing over here? Are we going to get some deflux of officers out there on the ground? Are we going to be put in that position? And the bigger picture is how they're going to affect small companies, small independents.
Can I come back on quickly as well, Mike, just before, because I think that there's a real concern amongst people that obviously we have these uplifts on these huge weekends, and actually that uplift means, like take all the festival season, or take, the 5th of November or New Year's Eve or whatever it is, those key dates in the year, royal events, this is going to be the fallout is in that, potentially in that big event uptick, where companies can't afford to PAYE and employ staff directly just for 5 gigs a year or whatever. There's no benefit to them in doing that. So when we shake the tree, I think there's definitely a risk of, from a security perspective, that we're going to be understaffed, and plans are going to be written to manipulate that position for more less security. So I think we just have to be prepared for that as part of this for the larger companies.
And I think definitely and I've put this across to HMRC as well, what we don't want to do is, because of the resource supply challenges, then alter plans to compromise safety in terms of crowd management, which is where the bigger concern is. So there is something that we are working on in the background that looks at an overarching supply driver. And it's something we're working with DWP, but not from the perspective of just taking anyone outside who hasn't got a job and throwing them in a role, because that's not workable. It's got to be something that we look at forces, fire, all of these people that are coming away from these different environments that have a brace. And we also need to consider the cost of training and whether things like weekend badges instead of sort of midweek or full frontline badges. So there are lots of conversations around this happening, which I will draw yourself, Annie, and others into once we get to that stage. But I think the key thing is at the moment is
they need to understand that if they work in a silo with the piece around tax, then if there's a compromise to the safety of the public based on the fact that we already have a lack of experience in the industry, we already have a known lack of quantity of staff, you know, those two things still haven't recovered from COVID. So, you know, I think we will all be saying the same thing, which is we have to think carefully about what that will do to the general safety, general national security, actually, if we're looking.
Well said. Sorry.
And I think, I mean, look, there's several things that we've had a mantra on. One, obviously, counter-terrorism, a massive issue and a concern, because we still haven't fulfilled that. And this is one way of tracking where things are going. We've got an education process, and we've got a profile issue in terms of quality of people coming through. So there's a lot of work that's being discussed at the moment. That this is why, I mean, look, if I'm going to be really honest, HMRC could have come out and gone, "You're all non-compliant, right? We need to go," because there's a lot of people non-compliant now.
Yeah.
So they've heeded the words that if you do that, the industry will crash. Whether it's hospitality and the requirement in terms of conditions, or whether it's the industry and the ability to get through the festival season and event season as it sits. So from our perspective, what we've done is stopped that crash and drawn back where we are so that we can get our shit in order. And the challenge that we have is there are lots of insurance mechanisms that need to come into place for a source supply, from a quality supply, all of these sort of things that need to be considered to move it forward. So it's not something that is understated. It's just we need to start that process. And part of the reason why we did it from an education base is so that we don't fearmonger, because what we don't want is a shitload of people going, "Screw this, I'm out." You know, and then we end up with 10% dropout overnight. That's where the issue is for us. So there is a very clear understanding that there is approaching a crash if this isn't managed in a way where we actually refine the process and start to help people and look at the resource and all the different nuances that are going to impact this after we've actually got it into a place to move forward. And the start has got to be education, and that's really what that webinar.
And I think of the 250 people that were on the call the other day, there's probably 10 times that need to hear the messages that came out of it, right? You know, you had all of the people who were actually interested in compliancy on that call, and I think actually we need to reach, and you will do this, and I know this is where we will support you, and NTIA will do an amazing job of leading on getting out to the industry, because that's what you do really well. So I have no fear of that, but it's almost like another 10 times this amount of people actually need to hear this stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's like, because the ones that were on the call took a lot away from it. Some were very worried, some were less worried, but you know.
But you know, if I turn around to you and say that we're now looking at speaking to local authority licensing officers and police licensing officers on separate calls, then we're also starting to address the communicators at the front line. So by them being informed, and when I did the Palo thing, that was part of the presentation as well. So 100 new licensing officers coming through are going to make a difference. So we are picking those people off quite nicely. What we need to do is keep this crest, and some of it is about, you know, the PR position. Some of it is about public, you know, the FAQs and all those sort of things going out and us sharing it far and wide. Hence the reason why I've got everyone's contacts, and we can now push this driver out to make sure everyone's aware. So 100% with you. We need, well, it's more than 10 times, to be quite honest with you. But it's, you know, from our perspective, it's a start. And what we've done is we've actually started the conversation in the small back roads and some of those managers understanding exactly what's needed. Because I mean, all the big companies have been on the phone to me. What do I need to do? What do I need to change? How do I need to, you know? And that's the starter for 10, because that just sets the scene. If we can get to local authority licensing officers and police, then we start to have a different sort of dynamic to the way that this is approached.
I agree. And I think, you know, it has to be, you know, this is where it's really important that the industry takes control of itself, right? You know, we have a massive responsibility as business people to do things right, and you know, we have a I believe we have a massive responsibility as business owners to try and support a better industry. So, maybe everyone doesn't feel like that, but, that's an MO for a lot of people who across NTIA and UKCMA, and that's where we agree, I think. So, I think that NTIA leading the charge with this stuff is also a really important piece, and that's why UKCMA is so supportive. Not that we like Michael, we couldn't like Michael more, but this is about the industry taking a lead on this piece.
And I'm sorry, Annie, I'm going to have to say, we all have a responsibility, and I genuinely believe, which is why I'm chuffed to bits you're here, the UKCMA is just within the context of this particular piece is equally important to this thing. Yes, the NTIA as an overarching body, of which Michael, as you know, leads the UK DSA as well. Yeah, the point is, yes, those two groups need to work together. But from the social economy side of things, you are equally as important as Michael, because this is where we need that kind of support for the people like Gary and others on the ground.
And I don't disagree with the fact that we're equally important to the piece, but the point, and this is an important one, is that we need to keep the clarity of communication, right? So NTIA are leading on this project, UKCMA are supporting them to do so. And we need to have the right conduits, because if we start going off and doing our own thing, it's going to be messy, and nobody wants that. So what we need to do is have a really combined approach, be respectful of the role that NTIA has been creating for more than a year now, but also support them in that. We have some very specific issues at the UKCMA with large numbers of staff that are needed on the uptick for big events, right? That is something that sits much more in our realm and remit than it does Michael's. But what we can do, the best outcome will be if we work together to support that with clarity and consistency.
It's leadership. Leadership is basically the thing that we've all got to play our part in leading, haven't we?
Yeah, we have, and I think we'll have our moment in the sun with HMRC yet to come. So that's fine. We'll do that. But I think it's with Michael and supporting what they've already achieved, which let's recognise that's a lot that it's taken to get this meeting in place, and it may be part of the process, and it's certainly not the end. But it took a lot to get people there, and I think Michael, a lot kudos to you for making that work.
Guys, I know, but look, it's nearly an hour. I'm sorry. We are going to think. I'm going to, Gary, because you've hardly said anything. So come on, mate. You can have a quick. You can say a quick couple of words. What have you got to say for yourself?
Just two, Gary.
Two words. Well, Mike hasn't answered all my questions, and the thing about Ireland is very important to me. Finding out about they haven't got enough people out there, and the only thing. Going back to it does worry me that we're going to end up going back to this sort of black market thing. But we've gone quite deep on this today.
See, Annie, quick final word from you.
No, thank you for having us as always, Ian.
See, Mike, leader of the pack. Yeah. See, and I am going to echo just there what you've done. And I know you've had to sit there and take it as though it's all your fault, but it isn't really. And what you've done in it so far has been fantastic. So that to you, your final words.
Hey, listen, I just want to work with people who want to work with us to get this right. So as far as I'm concerned, everyone's welcome who wants to be constructive and work towards the better good of an industry. It's not about us, NTIA, UKCMA. Don't really care what it's labelled, just want it to work and make a difference, or otherwise I don't want to waste my time doing it. But I think this is a good play. So onwards and upwards, and everyone's welcome that wants to get involved in making a positive change.
Right. So there we go. It's been an entertaining hour, really, really interesting. Mike, Annie, and you, Gary. We want you to come back. Can we? What I was thinking is it'd be great if we could widen this out and not do it once a month, but once every 6 weeks or something like that, where you not through this channel necessarily, but we can get this message out there and communicate this message, because Annie's right. We need to reach, how many security companies are there? About 6,000 nearly?
Just under 11,000.
Well, there we go. Just shows what I know about the industry. So there you are, 11,000 companies. There were 250 on the call. We've got loads to do. So, socials, Gary.
Thank you, Ian. So if you like to subscribe to our content, just hit the button below. And if you want to message me, not Ian, because obviously he doesn't answer messages, feel free to DM me directly, and we can put your questions towards Michael or anybody else or Annie. And if you want to talk about anything in the industry, please let us know.
Yeah, be great. So big thank you. Annie, cheers as always. And Mike, thanks for leading the charge and taking this on the chin. Because as I said, it's you gets the blame for all of this, and it isn't really you on this occasion. So peace out, people.
Take care.